doing certain very dark and unsettling things, which is a fact. But your starting point in this movie, as I understand it, was this comic book that really kind of rewires perceptions of who Jeffrey Dahmer was. So when did you first come across that material?
Well, thanks. And thanks for sticking around. So my producing partner and wife and I, after we finished this other film, had this idea that a portrait of a serial killer as a young boy sounds like a cool indie movie. And that was it. And I thought I was going to research other serial killers, become an expert in serial killers, and make some amalgamated fictional story about some kind of guy that would one day become a serial killer. And then I was also looking at graphic novels, naturalistic ones, not about superheroes, trying to find some source material there that could also be an independent film. And then I found My Friend Dahmer at Comic-Con New York, and it was answering those two things at the same time, and that was in 2012. So ever since then, I'd been determined to make the movie because it was almost like I had this idea, I was looking for something like it, and this answered that search.
And so the comic book is this black and white thing, but it wasn't just a one-shot. It was an ongoing story. So how much of that did you see as sort of the basis for the story you wanted to tell?
What do you mean by one? It's one graphic novel that's about 150 pages, right? Versus comic books that came out.
Exactly.
So he had Durf, who's the author of the book, Durf Back Durf. He was Jeff's friend in high school and knew him from junior high or elementary school on. He never saw him again after high school graduation. So when years later he learns news that a guy that he went to high school with is Jeffrey Dahmer got arrested in Milwaukee, it changed his whole perception of his high school experience. And so he had done earlier a comic book that became like a cult comic book that really just, he self-published and kind of got some cult following. But then later on, he knew that he hadn't done it justice. And so then he went back maybe a decade later and rewrote this book that came out in 2012, which was way more meticulously researched. He talked to some of his other friends and tried to gather as much actual fact from what they remember about high school as possible. He also took a lot of journals in high school and drew, as you see in the book, a lot. So he had a lot of his own archives. So he took that with the FBI public record, FBI testimonials that they had gotten from after they arrested Jeff, and he used all that information to create the book. And so there was something, hopefully this answers your questions, but that was so it's so dense with information, and he looks back from a modern lens at what it was like to be in high school in the late 70s. So he looks back and has a perspective on it that's different than when he was a high school kid.
Well, and how much of that saved you time on research? I mean, did you look at all this material that he had been able to pull together, or did you have to kind of find your own way in?
Well, I almost was I'm going to adapt this book, because I knew that all of his research was already sort of in the graphic novel. Have some of you guys read the graphic novel? So you know it and recognize maybe some of the frames in the film, because I used even some of the panels from the graphic novel in my storyboards, and they kind of then end up as sort of images of the movie as well. But then after my first draft, I went to Cleveland, and I stayed with him for a couple days. He invited me to hang out with him, and that was the first time I met him in person after we already had the option for a number of months. And we went down to Akron, about 45 minutes south of Cleveland, and went around and he almost gave me a page-by-page tour of the book. He showed me the roads that he drew, the houses. We went to Jeffrey Dahmer's actual childhood house. We went to the high school and walked around the woods that they'd hang out in, and I got a real lay of the land. It reminded me very much of how I grew up in Croton, right, in Westchester, and I kind of just related to it on even a more personal level. And then at that point, I was determined that when I did rewrite the movie and we got the film all together, that I was going to film there too. So the house is actually Jeffrey Dahmer's real home that he grew up in. And so that made it fun, because that was his real house, yeah.
And how on earth do you get permission to shoot a movie like this in his house?
Well, Durf took me to the house that day, or one of those days I was down there. When we were walking around, at the house, because he was like 2 degrees of separation in Akron from the owner, who is a musician. He had a band called the Waitresses. Which,
Get out.
yeah, so Chris Butler, who's the head of the Waitresses, right? So he bought the house because he was an Akron musician that had eventually worked his career over into New York. I had met, and he lived in Hoboken, correctly. And so I saw the house and stuff, and Durf and I were walking around, and the tenant at the time had mentioned that he thinks there was this shed up in the woods underneath some branches that was an old shed, and we went, and Durf and I like confirmed that that was the actual location of the real shed. And so between that and the house, I was like, I gotta film here. So then I reached out to the owner and met up with him and had lunch and stayed in touch with Chris, the owner of the home, over the course of the next 2 years until I would call him up randomly and be like, I'm getting closer, we're getting closer. And one day I warned him, I was like, it's not just gonna be me stopping by your house, it's gonna be like a bunch of trucks. And we took over the house for the month, and so that we could film there for like a week and a half. And we built the hut right back on its original spot too.
So obviously there's a lot of authenticity that goes into this movie, but then you have this challenge of the face, the character, and figuring out, how do you convey who this guy is while also conveying that he's a teenager, and that's sort of the delicate line that the film walks the whole way through. So of all people, you found a Disney star to play Jeffrey, Ross Lynch. So how did that connection happen?
Well, like honestly, like some people think, oh, it's a stunt, Disney to Dahmer and all that, but it really wasn't. I had met with like over 100 young actors. Once the script got on the blacklist, it seemed like a lot of young actors were then started to read the script, and I met them in like hotel lobbies and meetings in New York or LA, and then I narrowed down the choices to do some auditions, and a lot of new actors came through as well, but I knew a lot of those guys were not going to be a Jeff. They just didn't, they looked like me or you. They weren't going to be Jeff Dahmer, but I was meeting with them either way because I thought they could potentially be considered for one of the other teenage roles as well. But in that pool of like 100 actors, there were a few that I thought could pull it off. But then I met Ross. He came and met me in a hotel in New York. We met in the lobby and sat there, and he, like most of these young actors, had never really even heard of Jeffrey Dahmer, the serial killer, because he's, was born a year after Dahmer was killed in prison. So for him, it was just a role. But then he started to do research, and I just felt immediately that he had like all of the elements that I was looking for. Like he has enough of the likeness that I could pull off, and it got even better with the glasses and redoing the hair and the wardrobe. But he's also a dancer and a singer and a performer and really trained from Disney. So he's just really versatile. And so he had the posture and the gait, and he kind of got it. So through the audition process, he did his first audition via tape, and then he came to New York one time again, and we got to hang out in a rehearsal space for about 2 hours and mess around with the material. And that proved to everyone else involved with the film that he was like the right choice, even with Disney involved.
Right, that's the thing. It almost ends up being a punchline coming back to the Disney thing. But the challenge I have to assume with a movie like this is that we all know on some level who we're looking at and what happens next. It's an origin story, but you have to push beyond that. So what were the conversations like in terms of getting people on board with this guy and not just looking at a serial killer, because for the purposes of this story, he isn't one yet.
Fortunately, by the time like people were reading the script, I feel like they kind of got it because the book already had been out there, so they knew it wasn't like a jump scare horror movie, but it was this original take on this like unique experience. And then, it just like, I felt like we were making a high school movie, and that was, just one guy happened to be a future serial killer. but that was like my approach. It was like, we're making a high school movie that's politically incorrect because the 70s were politically incorrect. And that was very much a lot of the sort of flavor on set for many of the weeks that we were filming. And he just inhabited it. Every time before the camera would go on, I'd see him like roll his shoulders into the posture, and there was footage from YouTube of the real Jeffrey Dahmer being interviewed, so he kind of understood the like cadence of his, the way he spoke and how he moved, and he just inhabited it. And after a couple of days, I think we realized there was no fear of doing like imitation anymore. We just were like, oh yeah, we got this. We can just do the movie now. We don't have to like be loyal to some other footage. We can just, it's his Dahmer.
Well, and it sounds like you kind of went back and forth. You called him Jeff, not Jeffrey. There's a distinction to be made there.
Yeah, well, I'm so used to it by now, but the truth is they all knew him as Jeff in high school. And I think the way that Durf, the author, explained it to me is that he's figured out that he started to call himself Jeffrey later when he realized he was a monster. But when he was in high school, he was known as Jeff to his family and his friends. And so in the script, it was Jeff. The way I called him on set, because I like to call the actors by their character names, I called him Jeff. And that's why when he says Jeffrey, like in the mall scene, like I'm Jeffrey, it was to us like a hint that he knows that he's slipping. His sanity is slipping. Yeah.
So the other big transformation in this movie is Anne Heche, who most people have seen do so many different things over the years, would not prepare you for what she looks or acts like in this film. So where did that come from?
Just like, how did we meet Anne and all that? She was like one of the actresses that was given the script at some point while the script was circulating, and we heard that she liked it a lot. She's originally from Ohio, but moved away from there very early on, before she was an actress. I think she had a crazy mom herself, so she sort of saw her like own lineage in the story. And I think she's written about that a lot too, but I haven't really read her book. But we just hit it off. Like, I was hanging out with her in a meeting, and within about 5 minutes we were both like standing on chairs acting out the scenes. She's just like a force of nature and like a real spitfire, awesome woman. And so I just felt like she was meant to do it. And like on set, I talked to her very much like she was a storm front. Like, I figured that the family didn't know what kind of mom they were going to get every single time she came through the room. So I just sort of like once in a while I was like, yeah, you're calm here, but no, you're a thunderstorm. Or, we talked about it in other ways than just as a meteorologist, but but it was a way of her feeling like she could create a character that was completely unpredictable, and that was her character. And to be unpredictable, Anne's really good at being unpredictable. Yeah.
So I want to leave time for some audience questions, but I want to ask you in a more general sense about, it sounds like this was a very involving shoot, maybe even very enjoyable much of the time, but of course there is this element of you have to consider the ramifications of what this person is doing and how it's contributing to the awful things he does later. Earlier you were saying how you related to some of the backdrop and things like that, and obviously there are things that are relatable about what this character goes through. So from a storytelling standpoint, what kind of challenges does that present? I mean, how sympathetic are we supposed to be here?
It's interesting, in the last week or two, like the word empathy has been like in print more about the film, which is something I honestly am not advertising, but that's my goal, is that you as an audience member empathize with the characters. So be it a future monster or someone else, it's still, I think, the same thing, which is to connect with the characters on screen. But I made a movie that I'm aware everyone's putting their knowledge of what he'll become is having that dialogue in their head with the film, and that was on purpose. So it's why I felt like I didn't have to like give you the gore, because I knew you could be thinking about where he was headed. He was a human being too. I'm not in any way forgiving and giving any excuses for what he became, but I think it's important to look at the story as like a how do I say this without feeling like I'm promoting Dahmer? It's because I've said this 1,000 times already, but he slips through the cracks. The community, the friends, the family, the teachers, the other adults, the neighbors, they all miss the signs. And so I think he's an example of looking at history at a troubled white male who then becomes a monster, and he slipped through the cracks. And so it's relevant today because if you don't look at your past and realize how someone slipped through the cracks and understand with some empathy how that could have happened, we're missing the signs maybe with someone in our own community. Hopefully that answers the question.
Some questions from the audience? Just shoot your hand in the air. Yeah, oh, on the aisle there.
The
Yes, ma'am.
location for the high school, was that Ohio or was that also?
No, the whole film was in Ohio, right around Akron and Cleveland. So that was in Berea. I mean, if you're familiar with Cleveland, it's like southwest of the city center. And right, everything was there.
That 70s look.
Well, unfortunately, that high school hasn't changed since the 70s.
Fortunate for you.
But fortunately, right, it's actually now a junior high. They built like a new high school. So we found this junior high that was once a high school.
So another hand over here. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure if I'm getting this or not, but I thought that a lot of the choice of camera perspective was close. You know, that you were really close on people. Was that a conscious thing? Was that what were you and your DP trying to do with that? Am I getting that right? Or?
Well, I think there's a lot of wide shots in there too. There's
Yeah,
no like
yeah.
huge landscapes. Yeah, but I mean, you know, we have the steady cam and we're able to like sweep in on Jeff at the end of a scene maybe, or kind of drift to, you know,
Yeah,
follow,
you did 360 once or twice, I think. I
right,
saw
like
that.
follow him and
Yeah.
stuff. But
But I mean, it just seemed like you were really on people, or, you know, maybe that's because it was developing the character in my mind, and
Right.
I'm not sure if the perception is right or not.
right, I mean, there's a lot of medium shots. I don't think I've seen a lot of indies where they're like in here the whole time.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the case here. You know, I was
Yeah, I definitely didn't get the indie feel on this. I
Right.
got the, you know, like.
good. I mean,
It is an indie.
it is an indie, but I
Yeah,
didn't
no.
I didn't make it.
Totally
I
got
haven't been able to make a movie that's strictly for the indie community. I think my sensibilities are, if you breathe and walk and wake up in the morning, I feel like you could be an audience member. So.
So you should also talk about the art direction though, because
Yeah.
the costumes and those glasses, I mean, there's a lot of little details going on there.
Right, the toy with the bubble, the water toy from the 70s, and that was a lot of fun. Like I realized how great it is to like make a period piece, because there's like a lot of research that came in advance. I dug through lots of photographs. On Flickr, there's the National Photo Archives that has all these great collections of photography from the 70s, and I started to gather that up while I was writing, and it kind of gave you a sense of detail about what kids really wore. Because I feel like sometimes movies and TV shows about the 70s, they make it look like everyone just walked out of a disco, you know, and that's not Midwest. And my grandfather had a clothing store in Connecticut, and I remember learning from him that, you know, before the Gap, it was like everyone just bought their clothes from a regional manufacturer. And so I was like making sure that the wardrobe department was sort of buying from thrift stores and other wardrobe resources that made it look like it was a Midwestern town, not a disco joint.
Yes, sir.
It sounds like you did a lot of research. A couple of questions. Did you speak to the other friends of Dahmer as you did the research? The film that was made in the mall, did that ever surface? And what percentage of this movie was poetic license on your side?
All right, so it's 3 questions.
Answer them as one.
Yeah.
All right. So the first one was?
About interviewing the other friends.
Oh, so Durf started hanging out on set, and I, you know, became friends with him through the process of developing the story. When I was researching and stayed with him, I had met one of his other friends, who Durf in the book, and I kept loyal to it. He changed the name for the book to Neil, so I know the real Neil. And then that real Neil guy started hanging out on set too when he realized we were in town filming, and he still lives locally. Then Mike is this guy, he's a professor, Mike, and friends with him now too. He is a professor in Indiana. He just canceled class for the first 2 weeks of that semester so that he could hang out on set too. And he's actually like a monitor, he's an extra in the prom scene. They both are. So they all just like loved it. And Chris Butler, the owner of the house, he's the DJ in the prom scene.
Cool.
They just started to hang around, and the actors that were playing them got to meet them. I think on their days off, they all went out to dinner together. They just became friends. And that was almost like they were kind of looking at it and going, yeah, this looks like how it was. They were almost they were verifying for me that we were on target with the qualities of the production design, the costume, and the music that we were, I was giving to the actors to listen to and all that kind of stuff. That's question one.
And it was about you, in the mall scene, you showed one of the participants with a camera. Did that film ever surface?
Well, in the graphic novel, he drew Super 8 cameras, one of the kids holding. So I think someone did film it, but I don't think they know where that actual footage is. But when I hang out with Durf at his house in Ohio, he showed me converted other Super 8 footage of them hanging out in basements together as high school kids, including Jeff walking around the basement acting like a zombie, and other just hijinks of them hanging out. So there's Super 8 footage out there, but also the movie is set in a 77, 78 present tense. So I never felt like you could then cut to the footage in the camera, because that would be leaving the present tense of the experience. And then you had a third question. What was that?
The last question was...
Percentage, creative license.
Yes, that you portrayed the story with your own creation.
Well, I think the one thing that he didn't do in the book is really, because he didn't witness it, really investigate or couldn't verify what was like in the home life. Though he knows from what Jeff talked about his parents were feuding, their marriage was dissolving, and that was a way for me to sort of go a little bit more deeper and sort of expand that nurture versus nature aspect of this story. Coincidentally, my own parents divorced right after I graduated high school, so in this odd way I related to Jeff's own timeline, and so I was like, oh, I know how this thing plays out in the house. My parents, they get along, but I just sort of related to that connection. And I looked at that movie Welcome to the Dollhouse and realized that the main character, what was happening to her in school, she teased her younger sister at home. And I was like, oh, that's how he's bridging the two worlds of school and home. It's she's taking this information and, giving it and doing it to the kid at home, her younger sister. And so I kind of use that as a guide. And so the advice that the dad is giving him, he's then perverting that information in the way that he goes into the school to try to make friends, join new clubs, performs in the hallways. It's all because his dad gave him some advice that he perverted. So I had to bridge the two in some way.
Let me squeeze in one more. I think I saw another hand on this side. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the sound design. I like the fact that a lot of the music, besides sounding like it's regional, not big hits, but unlike most movies, it doesn't sound like it was recorded yesterday. It really sounds like crappy 70s radio. It's deliberate. I don't know if it was, but I was just wondering if you could talk about it.
So Durf, the author, he gave me a playlist of kind of Akron punk music that he listened to. And from there, that was a starting off point to find some real Akron punk music. So I reached out to some of those actual musicians. Not all of them are still performing, but they had their old recordings. So the final song is an actual vinyl that I ingested into an MP3 and put into the mix. And so there's a lot of that punk music that's coming right from the area, like the Numbers Band and Rocket from the Tombs that came out of there. We sort of saved some money to have some larger prom songs to make the prom more believable. And then just sort of, I also, the actual DJ from WMS Radio, I gave him sort of a list of the movie. I became friends with him, and he is the actual DJ voice in the movie as well. And he was the DJ at their major radio station in Cleveland back in the 70s. And he also looked at my song list. He's like, oh yeah, we played all these. So City Boy, T-Rex, all that stuff, it was stuff that was in play then. So I was just making sure that I was accurate. It was fun, all the research, yeah.
It's not all crappy 70s radio.
No.
Some of it's pretty good.
Yeah, and I mean, a huge credit goes to our music supervisor who found a way to bundle a couple of good tracks together from the same licensor so that we could really be as specific as possible. Yeah.
So the movie's opening this week. Not here.
This Friday, yeah.
But New York, Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And I hear word of mouth tends to help these things get out there.
Yeah, so please let all your friends and enemies and family members know about My Friend Dahmer. So it opens at the Village East Cinemas, which is in the East Village, on Friday, November 3rd, and then also in Los Angeles at 3 Laemmle theaters. So please help the New York, seats get filled. I think
I was
they,
in Milwaukee at the time.
oh, they
It was
just
like
booked,
around the corner from him.
they just booked Milwaukee today, I noticed, as a theater. Yeah.
But the people would probably like to see it.
Yeah, they've been curious. Actually, when we premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival, a local news station from Milwaukee came down to interview us on the red carpet, and they did a really nice piece that's somewhere online about the movie. And it was almost like they were letting the community know that the movie's okay and we're not exploiting it. And so,
I
in
think
some
a lot
odd
of
way,
people
I'm
would
looking
feel
forward
that
to
way.
it. What?
I think a lot of people would feel that way. I'm in my 50s and still impacted by the fact that this guy was walking around, maybe past me, by, when I was living there. So this is the prequel. It's a different.
Right, and they were letting
different
them know.
perspective. There's nothing bad about this.
Exactly. I think Milwaukee will be
Just telling
safe.
the rest of us,
Yeah.
it'll be fine.
So hopefully they pick it up.
And
They'll
I mean,
like it, they'll like it.
Ohio's really excited. Cleveland and Akron and all other parts of Ohio, there's just a lot of theaters that are gonna play it in week 2. But please let your friends in New York City or your friends here drive into the city and help us fill the seats opening weekend, because it really helps the future of Indy.
Thanks for sticking around, everybody. Thanks for coming out.